Have you ever wondered how entire countries, even the most powerful ones on Earth, can end up on the edge of financial collapse? Well, today we're going to dive into a framework from the investor Ray Dalio that actually demystifies this whole process. He argues that what we're all seeing today isn't new at all. In fact, it's a predictable pattern that is repeated over and over again for centuries.
This quote right here gets to the absolute heart of Dalio's big idea. Major economic shifts aren't just random events. They follow a kind of template, a script he calls the big debt cycle. And once you understand that script, well, you can start to see what's likely coming around the corner.
So what is it that creates this rhythm in history? According to Dalio, it's all about this repeating pattern driven by the mechanics of money, of credit, and, our own human nature. And right at the center of it all is this incredibly powerful and often really misunderstood force, debt. Which brings us to the big question for this whole explainer. What exactly is this pattern? What are the underlying mechanics that cause nations to build up just incredible wealth only to see it all unravel? Dalio believes he has the answer. He calls it the machine, and the biggest gear turning inside of it is the big debt cycle. It's a long-term cycle, often lasting an entire lifetime, that tracks how debt builds up in a society and is eventually somehow reduced. So let's walk through the 3 stages it pretty much always follows.
Think of it like a 3-act play. This is the core of the whole cycle. It starts off all responsible, then it moves into this phase of total excess, and it always ends with a painful but totally necessary correction. Understanding this progression is really the key to seeing where an economy actually stands. Okay, so the cycle begins in a pretty healthy place. In this sound money stage, debt levels are low. When people or governments borrow money, it's used for productive things. Things that actually generate more than enough income to pay back the loan. It's like the responsible early building phase of an economy.
Now, a really critical part of this early stage often involves something called hard money. Think of it as money with a limited supply, like gold. But eventually, governments tend to shift to what's called fiat money, which they can basically create out of thin air. And this shift is a huge trigger for the next stage because, who wouldn't be tempted to create more money if they could?
And this is where things get exciting and, frankly, dangerous. In the debt bubble stage, confidence is super high and money is cheap. So people, companies, and governments start borrowing more and more. Debt begins to grow way faster than the income that's needed to pay for it. This just fuels a ton of speculation, driving up the prices of assets like stocks and real estate, and it creates this illusion of massive, massive wealth.
Dalio uses a really powerful analogy here. He compares this unchecked debt to a cancer. At first it's manageable, but eventually it starts to consume the very income you need for everything else, slowly but surely strangling the economy's buying power. But here's the thing about bubbles. By their very nature, they can't last forever. Sooner or later, they pop. And this brings us to the most dramatic phase of the whole cycle, the deleveraging.
Eventually, the system just hits a tipping point. Investors suddenly realize the debts are way too big to ever be paid back. As they start selling, interest rates are forced up, which, of course, makes the debt even harder to pay. This creates a vicious, self-reinforcing death spiral. The very act of trying to manage the debt just makes it worse.
So how do you spot the breaking point? Well, Dalio says you got to watch for a crisis of confidence. It usually starts when investors, especially foreign ones, begin dumping a country's government bonds. Then you start to see the country's own people losing faith. They start moving their savings into other currencies, and companies begin hoarding their profits offshore. These are the classic signs that the end game is getting close.
But a crisis doesn't have to mean total collapse. Dalio argues there's a way out, and he calls it a beautiful deleveraging. This is where policymakers have to skillfully balance the pain of debt reduction, which pulls prices down, with the stimulus of printing new money, which pushes prices up. If they can get that mix just right, they can actually reduce the debt burden while still getting the economy to grow. It's a tricky balancing act for sure.
Now, this whole debt cycle, it's huge, right? But it doesn't happen in a vacuum. To really understand what's going on in the world, Dalio says we need to zoom out and see how this debt cycle interacts with 4 other massive forces. So these are the 5 major forces that, according to Dalio, really shape history. We've been focused on the debt cycle, but you can totally see how it connects to everything else, right? A debt crisis can fuel massive internal conflict over wealth, which can then spill over into external conflict with other nations. And all of this is happening while technology is constantly changing the rules of the game, and, random acts of nature can just disrupt everything. The key takeaway here is that these forces don't act alone. They're all tangled up together. A severe debt crisis can create political fights at home, which might then escalate into conflicts abroad. And together, all these forces create what Dalio calls the overall big cycle, the grand rise and fall of nations, which typically plays out over about 80 years, give or take. Basically, a long human lifetime.
So, okay, this all sounds like a pretty fascinating history lesson, but the real question is, why does any of this matter to you, right now? Well, let's try to apply this framework to the present day and see what the indicators are showing for some of the world's major economies.
This table gives us a really quick snapshot using Dalio's lens. And while you might see Japan's debt to GDP and think, wow, that's astronomical, the most critical column here is actually the last one. See, the US dollar's status as the world's dominant reserve currency gives it a massive, massive advantage. It can literally create the money that the rest of the world needs to pay its own debts. And Dalio argues this unique position helps reduce a lot of the immediate risk, at least for now.
And to put the US situation into even sharper focus, just look at this number. According to Dalio's analysis, this is the US government's debt, not as a percentage of GDP, but as a percentage of its annual revenue, its actual income. It's a pretty stark figure that really highlights the scale of the challenge from his perspective.
So, at the end of the day, what Dalio's work really suggests is that these big debt crises are, in a way, inevitable. They're just a natural part of how the economic machine works. This framework doesn't just explain the past, it gives us a potential map for the future. And when you look at that map, the real question isn't if the cycle turns, it's how we're all going to navigate it when it does.